Good afternoon. On behalf of the Iziko Museums of South Africa, I'd like to welcome you to the second Iziko Virtual Symposium. My name is Glenn Allard, and I'm an educator based at the Iziko South African Museum, and I'll be facilitating today's session. The theme of which for 2021 is the future of museums, recover and reimagine. I'd like to inform you that this session will be recorded. Our audience members will be muted, as you can see. Your video should also be off. So if you aren't muted, if your video is still on, if I can ask you to please disable that. You will, however, be able to interact with us via the function. If you can open that, you see that there is a drop-down box which starts with everyone. And you'll find me there, Glenn Allard. If you could please direct all your comments and questions for any of the speakers to me. When you do have a question for a specific speaker, please put their name in front of the question so that I know whom to address it to. The question and answers and discussion time will be at the end of all three presentations. We anticipate that we'll get far more questions or comments than we have time to address, so we do apologize in advance if we aren't able to address your question or comment. Once again, please make sure that your video has been turned off and that you are muted and that you are selecting the speaker view. The virtual symposium began yesterday and including today runs for 3 days up until tomorrow. And it explored art, today's social history, and tomorrow natural history. When we're looking at social history today, we invite you with us to delve into the social history collection. Our first speaker for the day is Tessa Davids, who is the social history collections manager. She specializes in standardizing and digitizing the documentation of collections, including policy development of the collection to the public. For the last 15 years, her focus has been on the audit of collections that prepared her well for the implementation of the new GRAP 103 audit standards for heritage assets. Tessa will be telling us exactly what GRAP 103 is. She completed a master's degree in social history at Stellenbosch University, as well as an honors degree in social development and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of the Western Cape. She is currently enrolled at the University of Pretoria in Heritage and Museum Department as a PhD student. We wish her luck with that. Without any further ado, Tessa, we look forward to enjoying your very interesting presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Tessa Davids. I'm one of the social history collections managers at Iziko, and it's really a privilege for me to be able to share a little bit of what I do and my colleagues in the social history collections unit. So my little talk will focus on access, growth, and accountability of the social history collections. And this also then forms the core business of collections management. The organization of our stores, the sound policies and procedures, and the accuracy of our documentation, those are the key determinants of our effectiveness and achieving our strategic objectives. We have access to and we are responsible for 21 stores in the Social History Centre in Cape Town and at Wingfield Hangar in Goodwood. At any given time, we have exhibitions at the Slave Lodge Museum, the South African Museum, the South African National Gallery, the Boerkaap Museum, Bertram House, Koopmansterwet, Rustenvreugde, the Castle of Good Hope, Groot Constantia Manor House, and the Maritime Centre. So we therefore assist access to these sites, including obviously our curators, researchers, students, scholars, educators, other institutions, photographers, service providers, everywhere we have collections stored, we need to be there to assist. The social history collections consists of furniture. We have 2 stores and we have a wide variety of furniture, textiles, glass, African studies, art, both framed and unframed, paper-based, including books, manuscript, ceramics, both contemporary South African ceramics, European ceramics, and general collections, including maritime collections, scientific and musical instruments, oriental luggage, a large photographic collection, toys from all over the world, an extensive numismatic collection which includes medals, money, ancient, paper as well as coins, philately collection which is the history of the post office and posting, arms and armor. And because of this, we need to have a competency certificate in order to handle these firearms. And 4 of us in the social history or in the collections unit or collections department have obtained these competency certificates, which includes the actual handling and shooting of firearms. Silver and so our roles include assistance with exhibitions, research requests. We do the loans, and we are involved in workshops, both presented by other departments within the organization or our own workshops. We do presentations, we assist with group visits, and we supervise and mentor interns from our own institutions throughout the year. So we physically provide access and correct locations of objects and examples of objects if the exact one is not indicated by the researcher or the curators or the student. So how do we get to these? How do we find objects in 21 stores and on 12 sites? It's obviously through our documentation, and this is what I am most excited about in my job, because the documentation will, like I said in the beginning, will determine our effectiveness, how quickly we can get to an object, and so we obviously have spreadsheets, and then of course we need to account for these objects at any given time, and so the movement needs to be tracked and documented. So we have object movement forms. Obviously, our loan agreements needs to stand up in court, so it's a legal document. Our new acquisitions needs to be motivated for. It needs to have the proper documentation, so that we can say at the end of the day that these objects do belong to the Iziko museums, and of course it's part of the national estate. And then we found out in our information of our objects in our catalogue cards, from our catalogue cards and accessions registers. With regards to the growth of our collections management would inform growth as curators conduct research and then motivate for the approval of new acquisitions through donations, purchases, or bequests. But they also consult with collections management first to find out the current status of the collections. What, is this object needed? Would it enhance the current collection? And that's where we would be of assistance. But for me, growth also means researching the object, finding more information about that object that will lead to more research, that would make the collection or the object more relevant. And that would obviously generate more access and hopefully lead to more collaboration. And that leads to growth. We are accountable to the collection with conservation when it comes to preservation of the collection for current and future generations. And so because we are responsible, we as collections, the collections team, we handle the objects. We need to be able to identify risk, immediately inform the conservators about the risk. We assist in crisis with fires, floods. We are hands-on and we assist the conservation unit with that. And we are also very much hands-on with any movement of the collections of the objects, be it for exhibitions or for loans. Few years, Iziko has prepared to include GRAP 103 in its annual financial statement. And we've been hard at work trying to answer these three questions that GRAP asks, which is what we have, where it is, as well as its values. And the first two, as I hopefully presented or made clear through this presentation, lies within what collections management is all about. We need to know what we have and where it is at any given time. So in preparation for GRAP, we've obviously had a couple of challenges to deal with. That includes just some, roles and responsibilities. It was a little bit unclear at the beginning, but it improved over time. It gets better the longer we're doing it. Resources is always an issue. The functioning database is on its way. And of course, the size of the collection, as about 97% of the social history collections are all heritage assets. And of course, we can always do with additional staff. Our successes thus far, we've had unqualified or clean audit since 2016-17 financial year. We have managed to procure additional storage units. We have unpacked about 95% of our collections. We have improved on processes and procedures. We have a better sense of what we have and where it is. We have extra space. We have improved our methods to manage our heritage assets. And so we have become more public friendly. Thank you.
I was asked just to briefly talk about a little bit about GRAP. And also there's one or two slides that was unfortunately not projected. So is that the Public Finance Management Act required the Accounting Standards Board to set standards of generally recognized accounting practices. So the standards of GRAP that the board developed includes standards, interpretations, and directives. And the PFMA also allows the board to prepare and publish guidelines concerning these. So what is GRAP 103? So the purpose of GRAP 103 on heritage assets is applied to recognize, measure, and present information on assets that are held indefinitely with the objective to protect and preserve them for present and future generations. These assets are often irreplaceable are covered with their value appreciate historical, natural, scientific, and technological or artistic significance. This is also, it needs to be noted that this is also a financial compliance. And so, like I said in the presentation, GRAP wants to know where it is and also the value. And so the first two questions lies squarely within collections management, as we need to know what we have and where it is. And then of course the value is with the finance, sits with the finance department. So I've been asked that if there's any questions, we can do that now with regards to the social history collections or my presentation. So you're welcome to pose some questions.
Hi, Tessa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. I'm Elizabeth Lang and I work at UCT. And as you know, we've recently had a terrible fire at our library, etc. And there's been a lot of salvaging going on there, blah, blah, blah. It's been very well organized and it's still ongoing. A lot of stuff they're getting out now is full of mold. And I really take my hat off. I also, did a couple of shifts there. But just having said that, I know a couple of years ago I read that there were a couple of skeletons, housed at the Iziko Museum, somewhere in the storerooms. And I was wondering if you've made work of actually trying to identify these skeletons and who the sort of the people were, the loved ones who were left behind, etc. I know that we also had to do UCT, where we had to we unearthed some skeletons and we managed to get hold of the people who's sort of obviously it's generations ago, but we managed to get hold of people in the current generation to actually sort of like do what we needed to do to hand the remains back, and there was a ceremony, etc. I'm just wondering if you know whether Iziko has been able to do a similar thing.
Hi, Elizabeth, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I just lost you there for the last part.
Okay, I was just wondering if, as UCT has managed to do they did a lot of work on the skeletons they found. It was very interesting actually reading, the whole process. And then they managed to, sort of hand over the skeletons back, to the current generation, that those, skeletons sort of like belong to. It's obviously people from many, many years ago. And I was just wondering if Iziko has managed to also do the same thing with the skeletons that I believe was in your storage.
Well, our curator of archaeology, Dr. Beatback, and her team of archaeology are very much involved in the human remains. She is, I know, being on this on the board or that deals with human remains. I can't get to the policy, and so she would be better served to answer that. I was hoping that she would be here. So that collection doesn't fall within archaeology is part of social history, but it's for unit. So that doesn't fall under the collections that we manage, as I showed you in my presentation. I know that a lot has been happening with regards to human remains, but unfortunately, I won't be able to answer so fully because, as I said, it's not part of my collection that I oversee.
Okay, thank you. But you mind if I ask you just a very quick second question? Sorry, Paul. Just a second question as well. I noted that today there was going to be some, dealing with the pandemics from the past in Cape Town or in South Africa. And I was just wondering who I could contact to have more of a conversation with that at Iziko. I'm busy with my master's dissertation at the moment. And I was just wondering if there's any information about pandemics in South Africa. If you could point me in the, if I can maybe email the right person at Iziko who can maybe help me.
Well, I'm sure that that Tessa Campbell is going to do the presentation later on. Will be able to. You should get in contact with her, and I'm sure she will be able to forward her contact details to you later on, or maybe even now. Tess, if you could speak to Elizabeth.
Hi, Elizabeth.
I really value that. Hi, thanks so much.
Yes, I'm the one doing the talk on diseases. I've mostly focused on epidemics. Well, yeah, so nothing sort of as episodic as the current COVID pandemic, but I'm definitely the right person to contact if you want more information. What I can do is just put my email address in the chat. If that would be helpful to you.
I find that very helpful. Thanks
Okay.
very much. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
And then with regards to your question about human remains, so Iziko does house quite a number of human remains, gosh, a couple of thousand. And some of those have been declared, I guess, unethically collected. And so like with UCTs, unethically declared individuals, we are in the process of trying to figure out who these people were and how, and in discussions with all about getting these repatriated.
And if I can come in there and just say, we've actually had an engagement with the Department of Sport, Arts and Science, Sports, Arts and Culture, beg your pardon, as well as with SARA. We were actually meant to have in April last year a consultation with the community of Colesberg for the return of the Colesberg 52. Unfortunately, of course, the pandemic brought that to an end. So the next step is actually to continue with that consultation. So we've been meeting with SARA, with various provincial representative bodies around the return of the Colesberg. So that is actually part of this attempt to return and to actually have these remains reburied.
Okay, Paul, thanks very much for that. I appreciate this.
I see that there are a few questions in the chat. Tess, you're asking if you need a special certification to handle the, indeed, it's called a competency certificate to handle firearms. It's not a standard firearms certification. The firearms does not belong to us as individuals, but we need to have our competency certificate is only valid for 5 years. So every 5 years we need to again in order to renew basically the license, so to speak. But there's also vetting that goes with that, the same as when you apply for the standard firearms certificate, because we have different types of firearms in our collections: handguns, rifles, shotguns. We need to be able to handle all of those. Yeah. Then I see there's a question about my name is February. I think it is, I'm not sure whether it, the exhibition, when I was there last, it was still there, maybe. In answering, and help me to answer that question.
Thank you very much, Tessa. I really hope that we get enough comments and questions to hear from you later. I find this presentation particularly interesting because ability of state entities to central government and to the population, our citizens at large, is such a massive talking issue at this time. And it will be interesting to see, and I think listen to how the heritage sector interacts with accountability as a state entity. Our next presentation is going to be delivered by Tywakadi. She has been a collections assistant for Iziko Museums of South Africa since 2008. She obtained a BA degree at UWC in 2016 and completed training in collections management and data curatorship through the British Museum International Training Program. She has been integral to operations in the Iziko Social History Center, working with the African Studies collection, including registering and retrieval of objects for exhibitions, loans and research, adding to databases and prepare internal and external loan agreements and reporting. Ntombi, in our radio interviews, both of them, there's been quite a significant amount of interest in beadwork, and I just know that this is going to be an incredibly informative and enjoyable presentation. Over to you.
Good day. My name is Ntombi Tywakadi. I'm working for Iziko Museums of South Africa. I started working at Iziko on the 1st of June, 2005, when I was introduced to social history collections as a museum assistant. My task was to assist with packing and moving of artifacts out of the National Mutual Building, as the building was damaged and needed to be renovated. This required me to have skills on how to handle, to store, and how to make detailed digital lists. I did not have any formal knowledge, as all of this I had to learn by doing. On the 1st of September 2006, I was appointed indefinitely as a museum attendant. This time, I was part of the front of house staff. I was dealing with customers and providing security to our exhibited collections. I again was appointed as a collections assistant in social history in 2008, 1st of September. And again, this time, my task was to assist with collections management duties. At this point, I had to assist with the packing up of African Studies collections and move them back to the renovated NMB, now called Iziko Social History Center. When everything was moved back to the ISHK, the task of unpacking the collection to their permanent location started in 2010. In between all this unpacking and packing, I had to do real collections management, like registering objects, providing accession numbers, number the object, take it, move it in correct store, photograph it, and update the lists. Retrieve object for exhibition, loans, and research. Add information in locus follow database, preparing internal and external loan agreement, and contributing to reports. Today, I'm here to talk about Beadwork in Iziko Museum of South Africa. As we know, Iziko has enormous collections of beadwork. Hence, I have decided to choose 3 cultural groups in South Africa to talk about, which are Xhosa, Zulu, and Sotho. Choosing these cultures does not mean the other beadwork from other cultures is not important. I simply wanted to narrow down the broadness of this paper. Otherwise, I would have taken the whole day to present it. You are welcome to visit Iziko Social History Center to see more of this collection, but please make an appointment and see if we will be able to assist you, provided that we stick to COVID-19 rules. I am going to give reasons as to why we as a museum needed to collect beadwork and the importance of having it in our museum. I am also going to produce answers to questions of the layperson that may arise when he or she is looking at our collections and exhibitions. I have conducted interviews with the people who identify themselves with the cultures I've mentioned above. Our vision is to inspire all people to celebrate and respect our diverse heritage. Having said that, by collecting beadwork, Iziko will be committing to its vision and also fulfilling the promise to the people of the public. Beadwork has a way of bringing people together and make them feel wanted and part of the community. It gives identity to them. It also can be used as the way of communication. Collecting, exhibiting, storing, and taking care of beadwork in our museums will bring knowledge to the young generation who never had a chance to learn about it. And it would be useful to the scholars to do research on it. What is the importance of having beadwork in our collection? It provides knowledge. It also shows skills that our people had and still have. It preserves heritage and culture for our next generation. It provides identity to communities. It provides means of communication, and it is kind of language between and in between communities. I posed questions to my interviewees, which are, what does the beadwork mean to you personally and your community? What does it symbolize? Is it used? What do colors mean in the context of ceremonies that you participate in? And what do they mean to you as a woman, man, girl, or a boy? My first interview, Constance Velase, answers as follows. It is something that is respected so much because by wearing it, the other person knows by the beads who are you and what stage you are in. It gives me an identity. She continued by saying it also symbolizes respect, in a way we are wearing them, whether you are wearing it as a girl, boy, woman, or man. We use it as our clothes to cover our bodies, especially as Ntombi zomhlanga, meaning the virgins. Girls, they are wearing the white beads in tubula or isigege, which means the skirts to show their virginity. And these would be in white color because it shows their virginity. Women, they are wearing isicholo, a headgear. The one that's on the picture, to show that they are married. They cover themselves by isidwaba, the skirt, and by ubulalu, the waistband that they put on top of the skirt. Young men are wearing iqabani. It's a necklace on their neck to show that they are taken, i.e. they are committed to a girlfriend. She insisted that one can't just wear whatever they like in the ceremonies, but they should wear according to their position and age and colors, which all symbolize which stage you belong to. Second interviewee was a Xhosa man, Lungile Deswe. First answer, roots, beauty of the culture, thermometer on who I am embracing my clan. And the second question, I'm reminding you, what does it symbolize? He answers as follows, guided by the wearer or the occasion. It will either be a life stage or a sign of love, or the path you have to follow or undertake as a person. Question 3 was, how is it used? Beads are used to soothe childhood teething problems, the stresses of the adolescent stage, or particular event. And the last question, the color of the beads is guided by the tribe you are aligned with, in line with the style and the meaning from the maker, as ceremonies differ from clan to clan, lifetime stages, and also when you are introduced to the knowledge of traditional healing, and when you are graduate from the training. These will differ significantly as cost to the healing practice can differ significantly. I think my third interviewee was a Sotho woman, Khomotso Tamara. Khomotso just summarized everything for me. So she didn't answer question to question, she just gave me what she thought. Khomotso shared the same sentiment as Mvelase and Lungile. She thought beadwork symbolized respect and it shows the state you are in. She thought it indicates the status one belongs to. Hence, there are some beads that are only worn by kings and queens in her community. She insisted that beadwork provides pride to her community, and it also used as a way of communication and to express sense of fashion. She also mentioned that there are beadwork that cannot be worn anywhere but in their ceremonies. In conclusion, by acting as a custodian of the beadwork collections, Iziko play a critical role in preserving aspects of South African identity, history, and cultural change.
I'd like to tell you a bit about tomorrow's session, which will be the final one for the second Iziko Symposium. And we are concentrating on natural history, and we're looking at a specific collections focus. We have 3 interesting presentations. I can tell you a bit about our presenters. The first one is Abrams, and at Iziko Museums of South Africa. His job entails processing field samples and data and digitization in biodiversity and conservation of the natural world. Our second presenter is Sibusiso Mtangata, and he is a professional museum technician with more than 10 years experience working as a fossil preparator in the Iziko Crew Paleontology Unit. He is an expert fossil finder and has formed part of fieldwork teams in South Africa and Namibia on research projects in the Permian time, which is roughly 250 million years ago. is Dr. Terry Reynoldsberry. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Iziko South African Museum in Cape Town. She obtained her PhD in zoology from Stellenbosch University. We will look forward to hearing from them again tomorrow. I'd like to continue telling you about some of tomorrow's presentations. After I've introduced the speakers previously, I can tell you a bit more exciting information of what we'll actually be listening to. And Abid Abram's presentation is entitled A Day in the Life of a Research Assistant. I can promise you this is one of our most enjoyable presentations that we have this year. On a day-to-day basis, Abid processes field samples by sorting insect species to a family level, as well as counting those specimens. Into family level, data is entered into a database and specimens are labeled and prepared for storage in the wet collection facility. The digitization of specimens using Specify software is also explained. This allows data to be stored on a system that is organized and reliable for future use. Our second presentation by Siso Mtungata is entitled Fossils from the Field to the Lab. This presentation discusses a Karoo paleontology excursion from the viewpoint of a field assistant. The Karoo Basin is one of the most important places in the fossil world, with its intricate and complex rocks. The Karoo yields unique evidence of ancient life not found anywhere else globally. The Iziko Karoo paleontology team happens to be fortunate and privileged to explore the vastness of life in the past. Our third presentation tomorrow and our final one for the second Iziko Virtual Symposium is going to be delivered by Dr. Terry Reynoldsberry and titled Creepy Crawlers, Who, How, and Why We Collect Them. This talk gives an overview of the oldest entomology collection in South Africa, housed at Iziko. It gives a glimpse of what happens behind the scenes of the museum, the staff that handle the collection, the types of collecting methods, why natural history collections are important, and the role of a collections-based research scientist. Good afternoon once again. I can see the participant numbers. Thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for supporting us. As you know, the theme for this year's International Museum Day is Recover and Reimagine. And COVID in the last year has forced us to engage our public and each other in this virtual format. We are still learning. Things aren't perfect, but the work is still going ahead. Our next presenter is Dr. Tessa Campbell. She is an assistant curator in the archaeology department at Iziko Museums of South Africa, where in addition to conducting research, she assists with collections management and exhibitions. Her broader research interests concern investigating the history of disease in South Africa and how colonialism and inequality have shaped the course of health and disease in a local context. Tessa, take it away.
Talk to you today about my research interests and the research that I'm busy conducting here at Iziko in the archaeology department. My research focus is on disease in the past. Specifically, I've been looking at 3 diseases: tuberculosis, leprosy, and brucellosis. So I'd like to start with just briefly discussing why we study disease in the past. I'm restricting my discussion here only to diseases that are caused by pathogens. So these are things like viruses, bacteria, and parasites. One of the things that we can look at is the evolution of the actual pathogen. How has the bacteria or virus changed over time, and how have these changes affected disease transmission or severity? We can also look at the relationship between us, the host, and the pathogen and how we have evolved together. So there are many possible and ever-changing outcomes to the relationship that we have with our pathogens. In this picture here, actually, you see these rod-shaped bacteria, and that's what both tuberculosis and leprosy kind of look like. Then diseases can also be a proxy or stand-in for major social changes or inequality. The arrival of European colonists in South Africa dramatically changed the lives of indigenous people in many ways, one of which was the experience of disease. And then lastly, we can study disease in the past to trace its origin and spread. We can look to the past to try and understand when, where, and how certain pathogens began to affect us and how the disease spread across the world. So these are just a few of the questions or things that we can explore when we study disease in the past. So we've spoken about the why, but how do we actually go about studying disease in the past? While there are many different ways that we can do this, I'm just going to focus on 3 of these today, because these are the 3 that I've used in my research. So one of the obvious ways that we can study diseases in the past is through the historical literature, so looking at the writings of people in the past. There is a drawback to this, one of which is that not all societies developed a written language. South Africa is one example of this. Here, the written text is only available from the colonial period, so for a period of about 400 years, and that is a relatively short time frame when we are talking about some diseases. So the historical literature only gives us a narrow window into the past, and we can also look for evidence of disease in human remains. Most of the diseases that affect us don't leave any visible changes on our body, and when they do, it's often our soft tissue that's affected. But soft tissue doesn't generally preserve well when we die, and mostly all that does preserve is the skeleton. So it's only when a disease affects the skeleton that we are able to see it, and this is actually quite rare. Bone is also limited in how it can respond to disease, and this means that different diseases can cause very similar changes to bone, and so it can be difficult to say for certain that a specific disease caused the changes that you are seeing. In the picture over here, you can see what tuberculosis of the spine looks like, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. More recently, within the past decade or 2, ancient DNA has become a very valuable tool to studying disease in the past. It can help us diagnose diseases in cases where it isn't easy to tell, and some researchers have even been able to identify pathogens when there are no changes to the bone. It can tell us a lot about the evolution of the organism itself, as well as the changes that we see in human beings. But there are some drawbacks to this too. For starters, it's quite expensive. You need a special lab to do the research, and sometimes, actually, most of the time, the DNA doesn't preserve at all. So we don't have any specialized ancient DNA labs in South Africa. When I do my research, I go to Arizona State University in the US. And the reason we need a special lab is because ancient DNA is very degraded and it's easy to contaminate with modern DNA. So that picture over there is actually a picture of me in the ancient DNA lab in Arizona in full protective gear to stop me from contaminating the ancient DNA samples. So my research, as I've mentioned, focuses on 3 diseases: tuberculosis, brucellosis, and leprosy. And I'm going to start with talking about tuberculosis, which was the focus of my PhD research. So why focus on TB? Well, it's the leading cause of death in South Africa. This map here, or at least it was before COVID, this map here is showing the most recent statistics for the global incidence rates of tuberculosis. And you can see South Africa there in the dark blue, showing that we are one of the countries with the highest rate of new cases per year. So TB is a very important disease in South Africa. TB is caused by a group of closely related bacteria that cause disease in humans and animals. These bacteria are collectively known as the Mycobacterium tuberculosis complex, or MTBC for short. So the image to the left of the screen is showing you all the lineages and species that make up the MTBC. The ones in color are the lineages that affect humans, and you can see the global distribution of these lineages on the map. Genetic studies that look at modern DNA have suggested that the MTBC probably emerged in Africa, either East or West Africa. And this is because part of the reason is that we see the greatest diversity of lineages in Africa, and some lineages have only been found in Africa. While there's still a bit of debate about how old TB is, studies have suggested that the MTBC emerged somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 years ago. So this map is showing all the known skeletal cases of tuberculosis around the world, and you can see that there are a number of cases from Europe, some from America, and a few from Asia, but in Africa, outside of Egypt, we know very little about ancient skeletal TB. So this is what really piqued my interest. The genetics is telling us that TB may have emerged in Africa, but we know very little about the history of the disease on the continent. So you might be wondering, how do we actually identify TB in the skeleton? Most of you, I'm sure, know TB as a disease of the lungs, and most of the time it is. But sometimes, around 10% of the time, it can affect other organs of the body, what we call extrapulmonary tuberculosis. And when this happens, you can get TB of any organ, including the bones and joints. When it does affect the bone, it tends to affect the lower spine, the spine, particularly the lower spine. And the process is quite similar to what happens in the lungs. So the body tries to wall off the bacteria by forming a granuloma. And in dry bone, this just looks like a hole in the bone. If the disease continues to progress, eventually the spine may collapse and paralysis could result as well. While the spine is most commonly affected, you can also get TB of any bone in the body. We can also sometimes see an evidence of lung infections. So here the bone isn't actually infected. It's just the constant inflammation of the lungs causes new bone to form on the inside surface of the ribs. But this isn't specific to TB, and all or many chronic lung infections will new bone formation on the ribs. So for my thesis, I wanted to understand the emergence and spread of tuberculosis in South Africa using the historical literature, looking at evidence of skeletal TB in human remains, and looking at ancient DNA. And so the consensus from the historical literature seems to be that TB was absent in South Africa before colonization. Therefore, it was introduced with colonial settlement. There were a few contradictory reports coming from the oral histories of some Zulu communities in KwaZulu-Natal, but these were largely dismissed. But like I mentioned earlier, the historical literature only gives us a narrow window into the past. I wanted to know if the remains of individuals might tell us a different story. And after looking at most of the human remains in South Africa, I found only 12 cases or possible cases of skeletal TB, all of which date to the colonial period. And these individuals are shown on the map. The evidence of TB is not equally strong in all cases, and I hope that the ancient DNA results would be able to shed some light on these less convincing cases. But I was only able to convincingly detect ancient DNA in about 3 individuals, which are shown by the asterisks or stars on the map. This allowed me to confirm a diagnosis of TB in these cases, but I wasn't able to get enough DNA to say anything about the strain type or lineage of TB. I don't really have time to go into too much detail, but very briefly, my results show that an early focus of disease at the Cape, which is where colonial settlement began. This is followed by 2 cases along the Orange River in the 18th and 19th century. During this period, the river served as a refuge for mixed communities of Khoi, San, freed slaves, runaway slaves, basically anyone who escaped the reach of the expanding colony. And then in the late 19th, early 20th century, we see a cluster of cases in Kimberley associated with the onset of diamond mining. Lastly, we see cases in the early 20th century among communities who provided labor to farms in the Northwest and Gauteng. So in general, the location and timing of these cases trace colonial expansion and its negative impact, not just in terms of potentially introducing the disease, but also the conditions of poverty and stress that were necessary for it to flourish. There are two exceptions, though. These two exceptions are the earliest two cases, which are the individuals marked MMK 235 and UP49 on the map. While these individuals do still fall within the period, they would probably not have been direct European contact at these places at that time. You don't necessarily need direct contact for disease to spread, but it is interesting that we are seeing the earliest possible cases of TB not at the coast, but at the interior and among early indigenous farming communities, which have a long history of participating in the Indian Ocean trade. Now, the evidence for skeletal tuberculosis is not strong in either of these cases, so I can't say anything definitively. So to summarize, the skeletal evidence does seem to support a colonial origin for TB in South Africa, but there is a possibility that Indian Ocean trade networks or even migrating populations may have played a role in the early spread of disease. At the moment, my research at Iziko is focusing on two other diseases, brucellosis and leprosy. Brucellosis is typically a disease of animals, and it's caused by bacteria that belong to the genus Brucella. The disease affects mostly domesticated and wild animals, and in South Africa, Brucella abortus is the most common species affecting livestock. It typically affects cattle, and as the name suggests, causes spontaneous abortions. Brucella in humans is what we call a zoonotic disease. This means that humans generally don't pass it on to one another. We get it from infected animals. And we are usually infected either through direct contact with infected animals or animal products. So, for example, the people most at risk of contracting brucellosis are those who consume unpasteurized milk or milk products, veterinarians, people who work in abattoirs, farm laborers, and on occasion, laboratory workers. In South Africa today, human infections are quite rare, but the disease is a problem in domesticated livestock. Brucellosis has these vague or non-specific symptoms, which are often described as flu-like. The most common symptom is a fever that comes and goes over a period of weeks or months. Today, we call the disease brucellosis, but in the past it's gone by many different names, including Malta fever, Mediterranean fever, and undulant fever. Like tuberculosis, brucellosis also causes changes to bone. It can also affect the skeleton. Skeletal brucellosis often affects the spine, and it can also affect the sacroiliac joint, which is the joint that connects the pelvis to the sacrum, which is situated at the lower part of the spine. In the early stages of infection, the diseases can be quite similar, making it difficult to distinguish between them. And if you remember, I mentioned earlier, I was only able to detect TB DNA in 3 of the 12 individuals I looked at. And one of the reasons why I might not have been able to find TB DNA in the other individuals is that I had the diagnosis wrong. In at least 2 of those individuals, I suspect that brucellosis might be a more appropriate diagnosis. It's not clear, while brucellosis isn't an important disease today, it's not clear how important a disease it was in the past. Before pasteurization, disease was more common, but accurate diagnosis was more difficult because the symptoms are so vague. But we do know that undulant fever was a problem, for example, at the camps during the early days of diamond mining in Kimberley. So what I'm hoping to do is to see whether it's possible to detect and sequence ancient Brucella genomes from any of the individuals that I initially identified as possible cases of tuberculosis. The last disease I'm going to talk about today is leprosy. Like TB, leprosy is an old disease that may have emerged between 3,000 and 6,000 years ago, although we don't really have a good understanding of where leprosy first emerged. Leprosy is not a major disease in South Africa today, but we do still report a few cases. In 2019, about 25 cases were reported with 120 individuals currently under treatment. The disease is mostly caused by Mycobacterium lepra and belongs to the same genus Mycobacteria that causes tuberculosis. The disease affects nerves, particularly the nerves of the skin, and can cause a variety of skin lesions. And as it progresses, the motor nerves become affected, and this can cause serious disability. The hands and feet are often the first things to be affected. The loss of sensation can result in injury and infection, all of which can lead to the body resorbing the bone. So you can see in the picture of the X-ray there, on the one side I've got a normal foot, and on the other I've got a foot that's been affected by leprosy. Leprosy can also cause changes to the nose and the upper jaw, resulting in the loss of the front teeth and collapse of the nose. And when we see this combination of changes to the nasal region, the upper jaw, the hands, and the feet, when we see all of these changes in combination, we can be fairly confident that we are, or we can be fairly confident in a diagnosis of leprosy. There's an incredible amount of stigma attached to the disease today. And in the past, to the extent that people who suffered from leprosy were often to leprosy. It was a leper colony before, it was a prison, and this is actually a picture of the leper graveyard on Robben Island. When I was doing my research on tuberculosis, I identified 3 individuals that may show signs of skeletal leprosy. As I mentioned earlier, though, we don't really have a good understanding about the origin of leprosy. Some researchers have suggested a Eurasian origin for the focus with leprosy is really to try and get ancient DNA, get ancient M. lepra DNA. While there have been many more ancient DNA studies on TB, leprosy studies in terms of getting whole genomes has actually been more successful. So we have more M. lepra genomes than we have for the MTBC and tuberculosis. I won't be able to say much about the origin of disease or disease patterns based on only 3 individuals, but if ancient DNA studies are successful and I am able to get DNA of the whole genome, we may be able to say something about the bacteria responsible for disease and contribute to a better global understanding of its emergence and spread. So in summary, molecular paleopathology studies or ancient DNA studies that look at disease in the past are still in its infancy in South Africa. Ancient tuberculosis research has yielded promising but limited results. So I was able to detect TB in some of my samples, but I wasn't able to get any strain-informative sequences or say anything about the lineage of TB. Brucellosis may be responsible for some of the presumed tuberculosis cases, and so it would be really interesting if we could get brucellosis DNA from any of those individuals. And leprosy ancient DNA studies may yield more promising results, since these have generally been more successful. I hope that you have found this talk interesting and that you have a better understanding of some of what we do behind the scenes at Iziko.
I'd like to thank you all for your patience once again. And now we go to the question and answer session. I'd just like to scroll and see if there are any questions that we have today. We have a question for Tessa Davids. Just curious, do you need a special certificate to handle the older weapons or just a standard firearm certificate?
Hi, Glenn. Tessa already answered that question for me while we were waiting during the technical difficulties.
Let's just see what we've got.
Can I go ahead and respond?
We've got a comment for Ntombi. I enjoyed your talk very much. Thank you, Terry. Dr. Campbell, I watched the fascinating documentary on an Egyptian excavation where they found the earliest record of TB in Egypt. The scientists noticed, but the high porosity in the skeletal bone. Is this also the case, or is it just the spine?
Okay. Hi, Sadie. Thanks for the question. So, like I mentioned, TB mostly does affect the spine, but it can affect any bone in the body. I'm not familiar with the case that you've mentioned there. Something like high porosity can be a symptom of many different diseases, not TB specifically. For me, that's not something that I would include on its own as a possible diagnosis of TB. But like I said, I'm not really familiar with that case and if there were any other signs or symptoms. So I can't say too much about that. But mostly what I look for is holes in bone, and mostly in the spine, but it can be any bone in the body.
Okay. That looks like it for the day in terms of questions. Thank you all for your positive comments, that it's very interesting. We have had some viewers signing in from overseas. I'm glad that our marketing has gotten that far. And I would like to thank our speakers today, especially for their patience, for their jumping in and getting involved in communicating with our public that are engaged with us today. I'd like to encourage you once again to register for tomorrow's session on natural history. If you consult our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or go to the Iziko website, which is iziko.org.za, you will find the remaining link. It's a very quick registration process. Click on it, and in the same way, you'll get an email giving you the link to join us tomorrow at 1. We foresee that tomorrow we will be running on time from 1 to 2 in the afternoon. We thank you so much once again for letting us into your homes, your office, your spaces. Please keep looking at our events, our online exhibitions, and please do visit us at Iziko Museums of South Africa. I wish you a good afternoon.